pull it up. Did everybody have a Halloween of some sort? Enzymes are sort of your metabolism. It's how it works. We've talked about a lot of them, right? We've talked about the PKBs and PI3Ks and PKAs. I mean, there's all these enzymes we've been talking about, and we'll just talk about how they work, how they interact, how they do their functioning, how drugs work. Drugs just it's mostly a bunch of enzyme targets. You're inhibiting things, and so we'll just get through enzymes sort of beginning to end today. Here's everybody. This is the creepiest of all of them, I think. So I put that one aside. But first off, because of that, the ability to, Michael Myers drinks Starbucks too through the mask. You know this stuff, or you know the endocrine function, and we can maybe talk a little bit more about it as we move forward. We can address some of these things a little bit more, especially if you have questions. Bring up those questions, and we'll get to them. But we've done a lot of this. We've covered a lot of these subjects. PKA, PKB. These are just enzymes. These are kinases. K, kinase, protein kinase. A, protein kinase. B, a kinase is just an enzyme that phosphorylates stuff. And I'm going to get to that at the end of today. And the signaling cascades are mostly just a bunch of phosphorylation cascades. But there's different ways that enzymes affect metabolism. And being a muscle physiology course, metabolism we're talking about is protein turnover, right? It's growth and atrophy. It's hypertrophy, atrophy, growth, decay of these tissues. Are we translating more proteins, creating more proteins? Are we lysing up some tissues here? Like what is it that's are we anabolic? Are we catabolic? The way these things work, there's a bunch of enzymes inside of the cell. You have a cell surface receptor and some hormone binds, right, and triggers a cell signaling cascade. So cell signaling cascades are going to be a lot of enzymatic activity controlling these cell signaling cascades, but the foundation of our metabolism is this stuff. Anabolic, catabolic, steroid hormones are coming from cholesterol. We know about testosterone, dietary effects on testosterone. Again, more specific numbers about dietary effects on testosterone. This is just one study. It's just a good one. But there are other studies that can quantify this stuff. So don't say like exactly here's the effect. It's just here's an indication of what you could expect even when you go on a low fat, high fiber diet. And then back to a high fat, or you just go from baseline to high fat, whatever. Trends of what you'd expect. Not like these are the exact numbers. However, this is just a study. Estrogen, right, a little bit different. Yes, it is anabolic, and we'll talk about that maybe a week or so. We'll get to how estrogen is anabolic. One of its mechanisms as it interacts with mTOR signaling, but it's different. It's differently anabolic. Oh, myostatin, follistatin. You guys are good with that. IGF. I think you're good with that. IGF is downstream from growth hormone. So that hypothalamic pituitary liver axis where we get the IGF mostly from the liver. The endocrine version of IGF coming from the liver. And yeah, sure, there's some autocrine, there's some paracrine. There's a lot of other tissues can make this, especially muscle is a potent generator, but that's autocrine, paracrine. And growth hormone, human growth hormone, you know what it is. Here's the most common 191 amino acid version of it, and the second most common version is just missing those reds. But women tend to be a little bit higher, right? There's a bunch of variants of growth hormone. It's not like it's just this one specific thing. There's a bunch of variants. You just happen to have that 22 kD, 191 amino acid version, mostly stuff that promotes and inhibits it. Know a little bit of that. There'll be a question or two about promotion and inhibition. Growth hormone releasing ghrelin, right? So start fasting, you get ghrelin from your stomach, gastrointestinal tract, and exercise effects, the JAK-STAT signaling cascade, growth hormone receptor, JAK-STAT. And it takes a little bit of time during exercise for growth hormone to respond, strenuous exercise. T3, T4, right? The thyroid hormones. These things again, sort of a hybrid. It's I mean much closer to polypeptide hormones and steroid hormones because they're not made out of cholesterol. But in terms of their behavior, they're sort of mimicking steroid hormones. They're polypeptide hormones that are a little bit cloney, a little bit mimicky of of steroid hormones. And we went over this stuff. So this is this effect, AKT, mTOR, P70XSK, that's PKB, protein kinase B. And so it's just a bunch of enzymes here. And so this series of enzymes that is ending in a bunch of translation, a bunch of protein growth, protein synthesis, so muscle growth, protein synthesis. And so here, this is what we really did in lecture 26. But what you really have to know is just, these, just know these 9 things. And the arguments that you hear are usually the first 8. The first 8 tend to be the arguments that people make. The ninth is what they believe. The first 8 is the arguments they make, thinking that's what they believe. And stuff like natural, steroids are not natural. Yeah, they are, right? They've been around since before humanity. I mean, testosterone is like as old as bipedal. I mean, it's like testosterone is as natural as the watermelon, and it is way more natural than the seedless watermelon. And nobody is arguing that the seedless watermelon has no place in athletics. Just go to a baseball game, like a little league game, and I brought everyone watermelon slices at like little league, and that's like, we have some unnatural things here. You're really loading up these youth athletes, and nobody makes that argument, right? Because no, it's not actually true. It's just actually totally false about steroids being unnatural. Now there are synthetic steroids, but like this, I mean, there's GMOs for food, and nobody cares if you eat corn, right? That's people bring corn and watermelon to a sports game, and nobody says you need an asterisk next to your name, and all of these things. It's the argument that I usually hear when you meet some students occasionally will make, or just people in general. But kids though, that's how the argument starts. And I'm not saying anyone should do steroids. I'm not saying like, we should all go do steroids. I mean, that's like I didn't, and I suspect most people don't, and I don't know what the actual numbers of people. There's a ton of people who use them, but the average high schooler, I don't think, is out there loading up on Deca, and I would suggest that they don't. So I'm not saying like every child should be on steroids. That's not the argument I'm making. But what I'm saying is the arguments don't make any sense. That's the argument, is that the arguments don't make sense. And so there was that Saturday Night Live, the SNL skit, Kevin Nealon, he's at the All Drug Olympics, and I played 10 seconds of it or something, and the guy does a deadlift and his arms rip off. I'm pretty sure on that episode, the musical guest was Keith Richards. And Keith Richards, Rolling Stones, right? Sort of if you've never read his book, Life, his kind of memoir, Life, great book. I don't even like the Rolling Stones. I thought they were boring. And wonderful book, though. Just the biggest junkies in sort of classic rock. And nobody, the barbiturates, and they're very open about it, but nobody says, they need to be, rock stars need to be role models for kids, and we need to, all they care about is, did they write good songs? Now, if Neil Young, he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. He was inducted twice into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he wrote every single song he wrote on weed. And in his memoir, Waging Heavy Peace, don't read that one, it was terrible. I love Neil Young, but but he says, like, I haven't written a song since the last time I smoked. And it's like, every time I smoked, I wrote a hit. Like, fine, nobody cares, right? What we care about is, are they like churning out radio friendly songs? Are they a jukebox when they do their drugs? Keep it up. When a band sort of cleans up and they stop releasing good songs, like my favorite active band, Smashing Pumpkins, is they got sober, and everyone's like, oh, you guys need to get back on the drugs, please, we need those songs again. Get back to like the melancholy days. You were like wasted all the time, and your songs were amazing. And that's That's not that, those aren't my words. This is like me paraphrasing it. And so nobody cares in anything else, but we care in sports. We care in sports that people are role models. But it's why? Why? It doesn't make any sense. Why do we care about that stuff? In most of these, we have logic on one side. There's logic, there's science on one side of the argument. And then there's people on the other side of the argument. It doesn't make any sense why they're trespassing over there. Philip K. Dick is this novelist, decent novelist, who said reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, it's still there. Something like that. And that's what I'm saying here is we have science, we have logic, we have rationality, we have reason, we have sound thinking in a human brain, and then we have like the bulk of the world arguing the opposite points. I mean, it's weird. And just because you believe in something doesn't shape it as such. If I believe in chocolate unicorns and like I ride around Stockton on a chocolate unicorn, that doesn't bring them to life, right? I cherish Harry Potter or whatever. I don't think spells are real. Just because you believe something, it doesn't make it real. And so on one side of all of these, we have like science and sound reasoning and logic, and on the other side is people yelling with veiny throats, and it's just that's the part that I find so weird. And again, with these so sports, what I was saying about Keith Richards is this: any musician gets to use drugs, and the athletes, we have to pretend they're clean. It's just this weird distinction. But sports are only there. Let's get to the soul of the sport, right? The spirit or the soul of the sport and tarnishing it. Sports are only there as entertainments. They're really nothing more. It's no more than music. If music isn't entertaining, people don't listen to it. And those performers have to get other careers. They go, I don't know, work at Taco Bell or get a job on a dock somewhere if it's like, Stockton 100 years ago. And there's only as long as the music is interesting is there a career. And like in the 1960s, there was World Octopus Wrestling Championships. Look it up. Right? In 1965, Time magazine had an article about it. Octopus wrestling as a sport. Now, I think that actually would be interesting. I'd watch that. I'd watch octopus wrestling, but not enough people did, and it doesn't exist anymore. So as soon as as an entertainment stops being interesting, the economy collapses. When the economy collapses, it's not a sport anymore. There's no such thing as souls that linger on. Like these sports are endowed with souls at their conception, and at the death of the sport, the soul. And they're just like artificial entertainments. And going back to this watermelon thing. And wait, they had people fighting an octopus. Yeah, yeah. Look up the World Octopus Wrestling, and it was a sport at 60s. You're not going to see. I doubt it existed into the 70s and 80s and 90s. Certainly not today. Although maybe it'll make a comeback. I do want to see tug of war, or maybe like synchro. Solo synchronized swimming as a solo act. You got to synchronize with yourself, as some of these Olympic sports. Sure, I'd like to see those as a comeback, but the world doesn't care. And live pigeon shooting, like, I don't know, that's a little bit cruel. That to me is just too weird, or too like, I mean, at least do you eat them afterward? I mean, is there some sort of, are you like wasting? Is it just killing? That doesn't strike me as yeah, I get all the like hunting vernacular of it's game. You're killing, hunting, you mean you're killing. If you eat it and stuff or whatever. But all these like natural, unnatural mitts are not natural. Your hand doesn't get so calloused over catching baseballs that you get a giant mitt that can rob somebody of a deep center home run. And cleats are not natural, and jock straps and sports bras are not natural, and none of this stuff is natural. The football is not. I mean, none of these things are natural, and the way we train, none of these make the tiniest bit of sense. And let's go one step further. When people say you don't get to alter your form, right? We need people to compete as God intended. The way you were born, your natural resources, because let's go one step further in the natural versus unnatural thing. With people competing with their God-given gifts, you'll hear that a lot. And nobody believes that. They say that. That's a word that they say. What people believe is number 9 down here is what I've come to understand. The people that I've encountered, that's really what it comes down to, is this emotional number 9. But they'll make all of these 8 arguments first before they get there and say, oh, fine, I yield. That's what I believe. And then you talk them out of that position too. But this idea of people saying you got to compete as God intended. Okay, let's talk about the Paralympics. Wheelchairs and sort of mechanical legs, and or even if it's like I have hearing problems or vision impairment, and I need corrective lens wear or whatever the audiologist or. But the people who say you have to compete as God intended, what they're saying, if we're being honest, this isn't like it's a pretty slippery slope. It's more than merely wet. It's like a moist slope. And what we're saying is people in the Paralympics, they should be they should be crawling, squirming across the finish line with their God-given handicaps. That's the sentence that's being said. And I'm not stretching the truth. What people say about no, you should not alter anything. That's what people are saying with steroids. Now it's totally natural. It existed before humans did, testosterone, and there's nothing unnatural about it. We use all sorts of unnatural things, and we also aid ourselves with all sorts of somebody who has a terrible vision. Harry Potter would be a horrible Quidditch player if he couldn't see the whatever little birdie, what the hell is it called, the snitch, if he couldn't see the little golden flying bird snitch. If he couldn't see that thing, he's not going to catch it, right? So he wears steroids is going to be less helpful, or the poly, whatever the luck potion, maybe that's polyjuice. uh, like vision correction. But you just consider Paralympics and how heinous a sentence it is when somebody says we should be competing against each other with God-given gifts. These are cruel people if they actually believe that. I mean, these are assholes. If they say that sentence and they follow up with, no, I really believe it, these are people you want to purge from your social circle. But all of these don't really make any sense. Where it gets where I understand what people are saying, because it's not just these. You can just talk people out of it and say you're insane. Like if you actually believe that, like I don't know what your IQ. You're like a single digit IQ. If you actually believe those things, number nine, I totally get. I totally understand number nine because we're an emotional species. We make sense. We rationalize emotions and we justify them, and I do it too. I hold just as many emotional positions as everybody else. I'm biased in my emotions. Try to tell me that my favorite, I'm wearing another band shirt today, REM, where try to tell me they're a bad band. I'll think you're crazy, right? Is it a completely emotional position that is inconsistent with fact and logic? Sure. Yeah, I'll admit that much, but I'll think you're insane if you don't think they're an amazing band. And you might do the same thing about somebody that I think is awful, right? They're like, oh, this person is amazing. I'm like, I don't know. They don't play an instrument, and there's pitch corrected voice, and they don't like understand music theory. And I could come up with all these rational arguments, these what would seem scientifically sound arguments. But the reality is something like that is a very emotional, um, circumstantial. Oh, you had lived experiences that associate with, whatever it is. And we all get to have emotional foods that we like. Comfort foods that are mine and comfort foods that are yours don't have to be consistent. But when it enters the realm of logic and science and stuff, we don't get to be emotional. This, I understand emotion. So in 2003, um, ESPN.com, right? This is October 2003, right before the andro ban. This came out on ESPN. And you can still go find this article at this. It's not secure, right? Okay, no, whatever. If you go to ESPN.com and go here, it begins, like this is how it begins. Mark McGuire's little home run pill is about to be pulled off the shelves. It doesn't begin with people's livers, people's hearts, 6 kids die. It doesn't begin with anything like that because there was nothing like that to report. What was there to report? Look how popular Mark McGuire was. I mean, that shit was everywhere. He was as famous as Trump is today in whatever 98, whatever year that was, that he broke the home run record. And I mean, he's like in togas. I mean, they like, that doesn't even look like him, but that's him. And every magazine and newspaper, and like in the back room, I have all his like baseball cards because I was a huge, I played baseball and coached baseball, and I was a big baseball fan when I was a kid. Not just a kid, but into my young adult life. And I loved Mark McGuire, and I was like an A's guy and stuff. And then everybody, they just got so offended in this. And this is still going on with ESPN. These substances called steroid precursors or pro steroids are one step removed from the substances in the law Senator Biden of Delaware said on the Senate floor, right? So you remember Biden was pivotal in the 1990 in let's make actual steroids, actual androgens, anabolic androgenic steroids, testosterone, or let's make those illegal. Biden was pivotal, and so he is here. When ingested, they metabolize into testosterone or other illicit steroids. What the fuck is he talking about? They metabolize into, yeah, they get converted into testosterone if hopefully. What do you mean or other illicit steroids? That doesn't make any sense. Right. Okay, I guess it could be converted into like estradiol. Yeah, converted into testosterone, and then you can convert it to estradiol aromatase. Okay, I don't know what the hell are you talking about. Like, so a lot of these people who are making these laws, they literally have no idea what they're saying. I mean, that doesn't even make sense. Other illicit steroids, like, Biden was a driving force behind the, and this is coming from somebody who thinks Biden is like adorable. Biden was a driving force behind the effort in 1990 that led to anabolic steroids being made controlled substances, a new bill, blah, blah, blah. But you have to acknowledge that Biden is a massive Phillies fan. He's like sniffing cardboard cutouts in this picture in the Philly Stadium. And he's a huge baseball fan. So they're like American pastime. And so we have these old like Senate leaders who are so concerned with America's pastime that we have to consider their emotions. If I'm making an emotional point, I'm going to admit the shit. If I'm being really emotional, I'm going to say, look, this is a biased position. I talk about my bias all the time. If we're making a biased position, you say it, and you don't just ram it down somebody's throat and say, no, other illicit drugs and whatever. You say, like, look, I want to cherish baseball that used to exist in the 60s or whatever. Whatever, but that's fine to say that. And as Jesse says, yeah, George W. was a massive baseball fan, so was Clinton. Yet there's a lot of, in politics, people love baseball. I mean, baseball has historically been the sport of politics, to my knowledge. Now, I can't go through every politician and say, here's their team and here's who that, whatever. But classically, the my understanding is that a lot of politicians are huge baseball fans, right? And let's go back to Keith Richards, right? And the Rolling Stones, and if they use alcohol, like nobody cares, right? Like, oh, we got wasted on alcohol. Nobody says a word. Their own mothers don't care. Nobody cares. But it's like, Andrew Stendione, which is banned in the NFL and some other sports, but not in baseball, was used by Mark McGwire during the 1998 season when he hit 70 home runs. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about health. We're talking about home runs in baseball. That's the legal point. How many home runs in baseball? Oh, that's right. The Bushes owned the Rangers, Texas Rangers. Yeah, that was my team when I was growing up. Um, Juan Gonzalez and Will Clark and Nolan Ryan and Kevin Brown and Jose Canseco for a spell and like all those guys. Julio Franco, I think, was on there. And that was the days when the Bushes owned them. But we're talking about home runs. We're not talking about health. We're not talking about an economy. We're not talking about health. Literally, not figuratively, literally. We're talking about drugs being banned because of home runs. Supplements, drugs, precursors, they're not even that effective. And at the time, McGuire dismissed public concerns about his use of andro and discounted comparisons to anabolic steroids, which are totally fair. I'm on Mark McGuire's side here. Mark McGuire is factually in the right here because the pills are available over the counter and they're not even that effective. Well, you can just go down to GNC and buy these things, and there's no kind of legal anything. They're not that effective. You take creatine, it's just going to work as well. It works ridiculously differently, but whatever. You're going to get comparable effects like creatine. And why does anybody care? Mark McGuire is 100% right. He's not like 99% right. He's like, I went down to the supermarket and got, next to Tylenol, I picked up some Andro, which has no known side effects, and it kind of works a little bit, and it's helping me, recover better. Whatever that, yeah, that's what we're talking about. Because he hit a lot of home runs, people are threatened by that. That's the same thing as Rolling Stones going down to the liquor store and getting alcohol and then saying, no, 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 no. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you are excluded from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Did you have brandy? Right? Was there rum in that Coke? You do not get entrance into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's literally the exact same thing. I mean, there's no difference here. Like, oh, yeah, I write songs better when I'm a little bit drunk or whatever. No Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for you. That's what happened to McGuire. He bought totally legal supplements that don't even really work all that well and didn't have any side effects and whatever. And he hit a bunch of home runs. And then they're like, oh, no, no, like, no, he's in like team. He's in the local, I think the A's and St. Louis. The Cardinals, I think he's in their sort of regional halls of fame, but he's not in the other one. So it goes on. The supplement industry has come under increasing scrutiny in recent years, largely because of high-profile cases involving athletes. Okay, I'm going to repeat that because that's what we're talking about. High-profile cases involving athletes. Athletes perform well, and so we have to ban supplements. It has nothing to do with health. It has nothing to do with any of those arguments, right? They're not talking about any legitimate argument of any kind. They're saying athletes perform well. We have to stop this. Now here is, and this is just, you can find all this stuff. There's 1,000 more articles you can find that say all the same thing. I picked one from ESPN, and then here's one from the Food and Drug Administration, from the FDA. This is an actual 2004. HHS Secretary Tommy G. Thompson today announced a crackdown on companies that manufacture, market, and distribute products containing androstenedione or andro, which acts like a steroid once it is metabolized by the body and therefore can pose similar kinds of health risks as steroids. Okay, well, that's sort of maybe. I don't know. We don't really have any evidence of any of this. Why would they do that if it is making high profits legally? Really good question. Yeah, emotions. I mean, are emotional. Why do people, let's say prostitution, let's go there. If it's voluntary, if there's not like a subjection, human trafficking, pimps and stuff or whatever, and it's consensual, and the prostitutes run their own business and volunteer to do it, and they're not driven to this, and there's no corrupt you get what I'm saying. Let's say it's like prostitution and it's under the prostitute's choice. Why is that illegal? That doesn't make any sense. Like tons of money, just tax it and stuff. Why is marijuana like illegal? Now it sort of isn't, but federally it is. And so very emotional things. Why are all these? Remember, we went through all the drugs illegally and made a strong case for: is it opiates, right? Is it peyote? Is it crack and cocaine? And it's just particular races were commonly doing it, and now, there's going to be more to the story, and I'm not going to be an expert on it. I don't know drug history. From what I've read, it's a very compelling case. It's just like emotional racism is the reason. And like, imagine I mean, look at how much money the drug lords have. Look how much money you could make off of these things, and like, no, yeah, we got to get whatever different skin tones in prison, and so there's a lot of emotional decisions get made. And sports, what an emotional domain. Remember, I'm the guy who got fired for winning because I won in a way that threatened the emotion of the game. I won by science and weird training, and stop running laps and stop doing all this ridiculous shit and the drills, and don't do all this nonsense ritual that's been around since the beginning of time. That, yeah, I understand that, like, T-Rexes, did this, and like we can go back to like the Jurassic era and see this practice in baseball, and like, oh, here in the Pleistocene is when we started, cheering from the dugouts, or who cares? I don't care about tradition. I care about fact and science, and we won that way. And I was fired, right, for literally, and I'm quoting, differences in coaching philosophy. People are emotional. They don't care if you're winning. They don't care if you're selling seats. People are emotional messes. Just watch somebody go through like, addiction or a breakup or something like that. And we're sloppy messes. And I get racism in the comment box, probably the best thing. What is rational about racism? I can't think of anything, right? Now you see it across the animal kingdom. Like, it's not like a uniquely human trait. I mean, ants kill other ants for their smell. I don't know. Like, and so you look at, in the whole animal kingdom, where we'll see like, oh, these birds and whatever. But it's not reasonable. It's not rational. It's unhealthy. It is harmful to at every level of civil society and the economy, and like, there's nothing good about it. But you have to teach people that, and people are emotional and they don't want to be taught. And it's the same thing with steroids. No, it's not the same. Okay, don't say it like steroids are just as big of a problem as racism. I'm not saying that. Steroids are silly compared to the devastation of racism. But what we have to admit is people are emotional, and we make emotional decisions, and we cling to them, and we justify them with false arguments, whether it's racism or steroids or sexism or any sort of ism. And steroids is just one more. It just happens to be a relatively harmless version of all of those, where we make these ridiculous decisions that are harmful.
Professor,
Okay.
if I could
Yeah,
ask a
go ahead.
question real quick. was ask, what's the? I mean, just out of curiosity, and I guess you can make this with a lecture. What's like the dumbest reason you've heard so far for steroids as your time as a professor? Like, what was the dumbest? Like, is it just one of these nine reasons, or is there something entirely
These are
different?
the only ones that people make. I actually have written down, I have a Word document that has, I talked about one of them where it was this guy, I'm not gonna say his last name, but his first name is Neil. And we grew up together. He was my brother's friend, and he made this case about how Babe Ruth didn't have access to all these things, and he still hit all these home runs, and he puts to shame, Mark McGuire and Barry Bonds and Sammy Sosa, and I don't know anyone else's name. Um, and I guess Albert Pujols was good, and that's like, to me, Albert Pujols is like a brand new player, and I don't even think he plays anymore. But that was probably the dumbest one, because I'm like, I don't even know how to reason with this person, because like, Jesse, you're here, you're like, you put Babe Ruth to shame. I mean, Babe Ruth is a hilarious joke compared to you, and anyone else in class who plays baseball, whatever, you're better than Babe Ruth was. And it's just, I mean, it's like, these were just untrained, unprofessional, ridiculous slobs playing the game back then. And again, I mentioned that when I was, whatever it was, in 2004 and 2008, and I was looking at the Olympic records, and I'm like, man, I would have been a world record holder in so many diverse events that I've never even trained in, or that I did in high school, and my high school time beat them. And you look at like middle schoolers today are beating what used to be the world records in the Olympics 100 years. And it's so silly to think that like Babe Ruth was any good at baseball. And these are the sorts of arguments that people make about it. It's the spirit of the sport argument, sort of, that Babe Ruth, yeah, how dare you try to compare Mark McGuire to Babe Ruth? I'm like, well, yeah, how dare you even suggest that the comparison can be drawn? What are you talking about? And so that's sort of the dumbest stuff that I've heard is yesteryear, and the days of yore. There's something so sentimental, and even there it becomes an emotional argument, because I don't think deep down anybody believes Babe Ruth was any good. But because all you have to do is look up statistics of objective measurements, not like the pitcher is horrible and the batter is horrible and everyone gets on base, but look up like sprint speed and marathon times, and whatever, the rowing or shot put, with something where it's the assessment can be compared from yesterday and today, and it's just so hilarious. I mean, like, middle schoolers would have been the best in the world. I mean, you take like a 12-year-old, and they're like unheard of in 1904. I mean, it just gets so silly, and it's not steroids that are doing it. We know that very well. So, but we would just talk about, these products advertised as dietary supplements, enhanced performance, whatever. Young people, this is paragraph 2, and the official, I mean, this is an FDA. Young people, athletes, and other consumers should steer clear, they say, from the FDA, of whatever. There are no shortcuts to a stronger body. This is FDA. There are no shortcuts to a stronger body, and that the best way to get faster and stronger is through good diet, nutrition, and exercise. Okay, there are no shortcuts. That's the theme. That's people getting something for nothing. That's the ninth argument that nobody actually thinks they believe when that's what they believe. It's the ninth argument of people are very emotional, and they're afraid someone's getting something for nothing. Again, like, if there was a lemonade stand that you drove by, and it turns out they were giving $1,000 to everybody who tried their lemonade, and the whole neighborhood but you got $1,000 for free, you'd be so pissed. Like, why didn't I just, all these people at $1,000? You'd be pissed, right? What did you lose? Well, nothing. I'm exactly where I was yesterday. My bank account didn't change. They're like, well, why are you pissed? Well, everyone else got this thing for not. Like, that's how people behave. And again, we have these cliches about it, about keeping up with the Joneses and stuff. Jesse, I'll get to that point. As if the FDA has never failed us before. We'll talk about this with supplements. We'll talk about this with sports supplements. The dietary supplement act of 94. We'll get there. So DSHEA, DSHEA. But so athletes benefit young people's health, and give them a lesson in the value of hard work. Again, other people getting something for nothing. There is no proven safe substitute for hard work and training when it comes to improving athletic skill. Again, these just people getting something for nothing is just really what we get into. And again, Joe Biden is sort of behind a lot of this. And then let's go to the U.S. Uh, News and World Report. And we have this guy, Jim Bunning, And there are no shortcuts in life, he says. This is his own baseball card. A couple years into his career, he was in the MLB. But look at this, like baseball great Jim Bunning. Steroid users have no place in the Hall of Fame by Jim Bunning. Okay, he's talking about himself in the third person. He actually does it in the article too. Baseball great Jim Bunning says, like, dude, that's your own mouth saying that. It's fucking creepy. Like, what? This is like we're the day after Halloween now. Actually, this is in July. It's like super creepy. But there are no shortcuts in life. Okay, this is what people keep saying. Other people are getting something for nothing. That's the belief. People are so mad that they think other people are getting something for nothing. There are no shortcuts. I mean, all of these articles say that. Yeah, there are. There are tons of shortcuts. Shortcuts are all over the place, right? Just type in the keyboard shortcuts and like, oh, command and whatever, control and whatever, or type in Mario Kart shortcuts. And they're sort of hard. Sometimes those shortcuts are difficult. They require, additional work or additional skill, something like that. 10 hardest Mario Kart shortcuts and hardest shortcut beaten, sort of. And this is a horrible movie. I don't expect you to watch it in a road trip or in like the era of Tom Green and Sean William Scott stuff. But it's supposed to be a challenge. It's a shortcut. If it were easy, it would just be called the way, right? So shortcuts are often very challenging. They're hard and they present challenges. Right? That's what steroids literally are, a shortcut. That's fine to call them that. They are a shortcut. What you would get there in 12 weeks with no steroids, and maybe you get there in 8 weeks with steroids. Okay, you cut your progress, your development time short by 4 weeks. Great. You worked way harder, right? That's what the steroids allowed you to do. If you did the steroids and hung around and didn't train any differently, nothing happens, right? They allow you to, it's a recuperative power. They allow you to recover faster. Remember, I made that comparison to like Concerta and Ritalin, Adderall, stuff like that. And if you take these things or just take straight dextroamphetamine as a ergogenic aid, if it's not like, look, I need these things as my prescription. If it's I'm taking this as an ergogenic aid, they allow you to work harder. If you decide not to work harder, you don't get any more work done. You don't get smarter. You don't advance your career. You don't accomplish anything if you decide not to work harder. They permit harder work. That's what those things do. And I've done those. I do those. And so it was a shortcut, right? Okay, so I have 50 hours of work to do. Whew. Okay, I can probably do that in 3 days if I use Adderall or something, and that's a shortcut, right? Now it allows you to work hard. It's not like, well, I'm going to take Adderall and then I'm going to lie around watching. I'm going to do the entire Office from first season to ninth or whatever it was. That doesn't help, right? Being allowed, being enabled to work harder is what happens. And so that's, yeah, of course it's a shortcut. And there's tons of shortcuts. And why are you offended by shortcuts? And so this idea that people get something for nothing seems to be, now I'm not saying fact, right? I'm not Dwight Schrute here, but it seems to be what people actually believe. It's an emotional one. And man, you can't talk people out of emotions. But when you look at the facts of the Dwight Schrute, like, you start to see inconsistencies with science and logic, and it doesn't make it's totally nonsense. It just doesn't make any rational sense at all. So steroids. So the types of questions, know those nine. Now, do you have to know the arguments themselves and little pithy rejoinders if somebody brings them up? No, but know what those arguments are, sort of by name. Know what those arguments are so you can know what you encounter, and you can know if you're making, it's totally fine. You can be the biggest anti-steroid person in the world, the biggest opponent of steroids, advocate of clean training. Totally fine. This is not me trying to talk you out of the position. This is just me saying, like, let's be logical here. And there's logic is not being applied in any of these arguments. Emotion is being applied, and maybe emotion is being misapplied. Maybe we're miscalibrating uh, our dissection of the phenomenon. So other questions I might ask, just stuff like this, right?
Um,
Go ahead.
Professor, do you think that one day, like in the sports world, it'll be like strongman, just seeing how far the human body can reach, like passing through certain limits?
Yeah, I do think so, and that's what we have in bodybuilding. There's like fake testing, and we pretend sports are natural so that we can so that society accepts it. But why doesn't society accept? Let's go back to I'm making cases on things I haven't done, right? So when I'm talking about prostitutes, don't think I'm like justifying, oh, Courtney's down at the whorehouse, oh, there's the brothel again. This is not a practice I've ever done, but I don't understand why it's a problem. Right? It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Consenting
Yeah.
adults.
I'm a huge Brian Shaw fan. So like when I watch World's Strongest Man, like I don't know if you saw Hofthor's 501 kilo deadlift.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, we all know they're like taking something, but it's insane how far the human body is able to like push these certain things. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's what I want to see. I want the spectacular. I want to see somebody do a high jump that clears the pole vaulting. Like if that, like I can high jump higher than you can pole vault. I want to see that. That'd be amazing. Imagine the number of YouTube views it would have if somebody was like, okay, I can shot put um like from here to Lodi, like, I can hit the movie theater from Stockton, the Lodi movie. Like that, that would have like a billion YouTube views. If like a shot put and you can't even see it, looks like a golf ball disappearing into the sky. If somebody has now, I don't want to see like boxing where it's like, oh, what's one punch death? Like, okay, that's creepy, right? I don't want to see the faces of death. But yeah, so like World's Strongest Man and stuff like that, it'd be interesting. It'd be so fascinating. And the athletes are, if they're willing to do it, open-eyed, knowing what the side effects are at that level of dosing, right? Yeah, okay, you may be encountering some side effects. Good luck having kids or whatever. With that dose, and if they know the side effects of becoming a 400-pound person with 3% body fat, it'd be fascinating, and it would create an economy, and I would enjoy watching it, and I'm sure people would have the same people just like watch the politicians who come out against like the homophobic politicians. They always have a history. It's weird. The anti the people, the politicians who, I mean, just look this stuff up on, just Google them. Like the politicians who are so violently opposed to prostitution, it's like they get busted at the brothel, and so the people who are so emotionally against steroid use and so vehemently shouting about it on whatever it is, ESPN or something, that would be their, what someone would call a guilty pleasure. Like they would be watching it and like recording it and watching when no one's looking at it. And so now I say some of this in exaggeration, some of it in jest, and some of it as fact. And I assume you can sift through the wheat and chaff there, but I don't think anybody's going to be throwing a shot put from city to city and stuff. But you get the idea, the theme of what I'm saying here. So these are the types of questions I would probably ask. Okay, let's talk about enzymes. So this is PKB. You don't need to like draw PKB, but PKB is going to keep making an enormous appearance. It's going to be this central figure. It's going to be like, let's stick with The Office. PKB is, I don't know, who's like the main character? Is it Jim, I guess? Maybe, whatever. Jim or Dwight or something, I don't know, whatever. Whoever like the main character is PKB. That's really, let's say PKB is Dwight, the big anabolic one. And so what we know about metabolism. So metabolism is essentially just a bunch of enzymes, but it's a sum of all of your chemical reactions. You have some anabolic reactions, right? You have some catabolic reactions, and you just sum all of this stuff up, and that's what your metabolism is. And they're catalyzed by enzymes. So catalysis, catalyst, whatever, these enzymes are facilitating these chemical reactions. But what does that even mean? Right. So to catalyze something, what does that actually mean? Because what I don't want people to do is just memorize a bunch of lines. Reactions are catalyzed by enzymes. That's not a sentence that I want people to take with them in life. So the idea of memorizing lines, it's fine to memorize vocabulary, protein kinase B and AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase, and PI3K, phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase, and to memorize a bunch of vocabulary, totally fine. Memorize your vocabulary, but don't memorize lines. I want you to understand how stuff works, and you already know this one, but you'll hear this at gyms or whatever, just old ladies talking about why they're run yesterday or something like that. Oh, on the treadmill, endorphins, those things sure make you feel good. Those endorphins, you'll hear people say this, and they have no idea what the hell they're saying. Endorphins make you feel good. That's a memorized line. They don't know what endorphins are. You do. You know what an endorphin is because we've talked about this. Endogenous morphine, right? Endogenous morphine. But when you ask people, you ask the lady who just went for a jog, oh, endorphins sure make you feel good, don't they? Okay, well, what is an endorphin? Ask them. Try this. Do try this at home. Well, it's a thing that gets released when you exercise, and it really makes you feel better. Okay, a thing gets released. Okay, really question people when they say these memorized lines. A thing that gets released from where? Right? Where is this thing released? Where are you releasing this? In your body. You're releasing endorphins in your body. Okay, it's a thing, right? Endorphins are a thing, and they're released in the body, and it makes you feel good. That just doesn't mean anything, right? Well, can you at least, tell me like how this thing is making you feel good? Oh, it affects your mood states. All gibberish. None of this means the tiniest thing. No, it doesn't mean anything. And so let's just figure stuff out. Endorphins make you feel. What is an endorphin? Again, endogenous morphine, right? We have these opioid receptors. It is binds to it, right? So endogenous means inside of you as opposed to exogenous. Go do your whatever, like poppy plant derivative, go do your heroin and so endogenous morphine, right? We have our opioid receptors, and we know what that stuff does. And where is it being released from? Well, a pituitary, right? Some immune cells will make this stuff too. Like macrophages can release it, but mostly the pituitary. They make endogenous morphine. It's going to bind. When it binds, it has effects, right? If it binds in the peripheral nervous system, we're reducing stuff like substance P, you know what that is, right? There's also central nervous system effects. Now, I'm not going to ask you this stuff on the test. The idea is know what you're talking about. Don't make sentences and then like move on and hope nobody asks you about it. Whatever you say, you should know something about. And so or admit, so like, I don't know, like Patrick is going to ask me 1,000 questions today, and like, what, I have hunches that I can work from. Let me speculate based on what I do know. People just say shit that they don't know, and then they pretend it's true, and then they move on and hope nobody calls them out. They don't do that in life. It takes work to really learn stuff, but you should distrust people who don't do it. Another one, a memorized line, and you'll hear this in sort of undergraduate ex-phys, where it's just like your standard exercise physiology. PFK is a regulatory step in glycolysis. And then it stops and nobody says what the hell that means. PFK, phosphofructokinase, right? PFK is a regulatory step in glycolysis. Yeah, everyone says that. The textbooks say that and move on. And I remember being an undergrad and seeing that in textbooks, like, what does that mean? I ask people and nobody has any idea what it means. I ask like 10 people who say that. Nobody knows what the hell they're talking about. They just say the line and move on. And it drove me crazy. So obviously you go look this stuff up, and you should too. This is in French, right? Poulet, whatever, Poule. That's chicken. I think this is hen. I think with a T on it. I don't speak French. But so whatever. The Paris fried kitchens, whatever. And I'll get to that one. I'm going to explain PFK because it's an enzyme, and I'm going to talk about regulating enzymes. To say enzymes catalyze reactions and to move on, to not explain it, is like saying ketones result from the incomplete breakdown of fat. If that's all you're taught, and then you move on, what do you mean the incomplete breakdown of fat? Like you go through lipolysis, and then what if let's send this thing into the mitochondria, and then it becomes a ketone? What do you mean the incomplete? No, it's just the incomplete breakdown. What the hell are you talking about, though? That's not a sentence, right? That doesn't mean anything. That doesn't communicate anything. And we'll talk about this later probably, but in case we don't, in your liver, you can do gluconeogenesis, make carbs from non-carb sources. And you're on a low carb diet, or you're on Atkins or whatever diet, you're on a low carb diet, ketogenic diet, and ketogenic diet. And you make carbs from non-carb sources, so like oxaloacetates in the Krebs cycle. Okay, that thing's great. Let's send that off to make a bunch of carbs, to make some sugar. Gluconeogenesis, sugar new genesis from non-carb sources. But when you get rid of oxaloacetate, that's the thing acetyl-CoA is supposed to bind to. Right, you chop up your fats. You have like a 16 carbon fat. Let's get 8 acetyl-CoAs from it. And so those acetyl-CoAs are supposed to bind to oxaloacetate. Well, not if you've rerouted all that to form a bunch of new carbs, gluconeogenesis. And so those acetyl-CoAs bind to each other. Two acetyl-CoAs show up to their date, right? And their date is nowhere to be found. They were stood up. right? So a couple of acetyl-CoAs show up to the restaurant, they have a date, and the date isn't there. And so the acetyl-CoAs look at each other and say, all right, let's do this, right? You got stood up, I got stood up. Why don't we mate or whatever? And so acetyl-CoA plus acetyl-CoA, you got aceto-acetyl-CoA. Couple more steps, right? HMG-CoA. You get a couple more steps, and then you get to your ketones. You get to uh, acetoacetate, and you get to these like acetones, the one you like piss out and breathe out, and that's the one you test for. Hydroxybutyrate, that's your more metabolic one. But that's how you get these things, is in the liver. You have acetyl CoAs linking up, not like incomplete breakdown of fat. That doesn't mean anything to anybody. It just confuses people, and then people use memorized lines and try to pretend like they know what they're talking about. Don't do that. Know less, but know it well. Don't try to memorize 1,000 things and know them poorly, right? Memorize like 10 things and know them well, and then move on to the 11th thing and the 12th thing. So again, metabolism and what enzymes are doing in the body, and they're catalyzing these reactions. So metabolism is a bunch of chemical reactions, and enzymes are sort of the stockbrokers of these chemical reactions. They sort of, sometimes they take a cut, right? If there's like ATP consumed in the process, right? Maybe there's a percentage, like you pay your real estate agent 6% of the sale. But not always, right? So sometimes you have these sort of free reactions, but they're catalyzing these reactions in your metabolism, and they just really speed things up, right? I mean, like billions of times faster. It really speed things up. I mean, yeah, this reaction is going to happen by the time the Earth, like crashes into the sun or whatever. This chemical reaction is going to happen, but let's just really ramp up the speed of this thing so we're like viable as human creatures, as like biological creatures. If you didn't have enzymes, you die. Like now, you're not going to make it to the end of the sentence. If you don't have enzymes, like your metabolism shuts down. You do not work. And so enzymes catalyze reactions. It's like saying these things. We have to know what that means, right? So there's reactions, right? We have these substrates, or we have reactants or substrates, whatever you want to call it, go into an enzyme, right? Let's bind to this enzyme. The enzyme, works its wiles on us. It works its wonders. Then we get our products. So these reactants or these substrates come in, and these products come out. And if we talk about lowering the activation energy of these things. Now, yeah, it's going to take forever to do this, but really we lower the activation energy, and it's easier. So the better way of thinking of this is Black Friday is coming up, right? Thanksgiving is around a couple of corners, right? It's not around like this coming corner, but a couple corners from now, it's right around that. And if we use enzymes to put these bright orange stickers on the food, you lower the price of something, you lower the activation energy, and this meat would have turned gray and sat there, and they would have thrown it away eventually. But they lower the price, and suddenly people are buying it. That's what enzymes do. They put manager special stickers on your chemical reactions, right? So it's a sort of Black Friday. Like people are running in here for like garbage, and they're going to get trampled to death for their TV that nobody wanted. Let's put really low prices on stuff that was never going to sell anyway. That's the Black Friday model. Get people in the door, and maybe they'll buy some other stuff too. And this stuff has been on the shelf for 9 months. Why don't we lower it to some ludicrous amount where people actually buy it? Enzymes lower the activation energy. Suddenly it's in everyone's shopping cart, speeding things up. They don't get used up in the process. You can kill these things. We'll talk about that. Now, the way they work, the way these enzymes work, is they have an active site, and the substrate, the reactant, the substrate, whatever you want to call it, is going to bind to that active site. Look at the shape, like the same shape, right? And so there's sort of if I ask you, like, let's say you're single and you're looking at, entering the dating world, and I'm trying to play matchmaker, and I say, well, what type of person are you looking for? And you have the person all mapped out in your head. I'm looking for Jessica Rabbit or whatever, or I'm looking for Roger Rabbit. And you like describe the person. That's what this is. You have a type, right? You have this specific, we'll call it like enzyme sexiness, where there's a specific person you're trying to bond with. That's my mate right there. That's the person I'm trying to hook up with. And maybe like wanted ads, whatever, the match.com or whatever it is trying to pair people, trying to pair, substrates with the right enzymes, trying to play matchmaker. But we just, there's a nice pairing here. This isn't going to bond with any old thing. It bonds with this particular socket, with that particular shape. And then you'll get your enzymatic reaction afterward. Now, think about plugs and sockets. Easy way of illustrating this. There's whatever, 14, 15, I don't know how many are there. All these different sockets. And wherever you are in the world, I have this versatile adapter where if I'm traveling, if I'm in Asia or Africa or something, it just depends on what kind of socket there, or in whatever parts of Europe or something. It depends what the socket looks like. And my electronics aren't going to plug into that, right? I'm not going to take like my American thing and go plug it into like this weird thing, or like this is like, what do I put here? Like, and so, I have this little like adaptable thing where wherever you are in the world, you can plug in your electronics, and it's like, they like explode and stuff still, like totally messes everything up. But so there's specific plugs fit specific sockets, right? All these different, now there's, in enzymes, I mean, there's thousands of these. There aren't just like 14 or 15 or whatever of these things. There's like thousands of these, and they have their specific sockets. Specific plugs have specific sockets. Now, sometimes we've talked a little bit about hormones. I said like insulin-like growth factor. Yeah, you can jostle that thing into the socket, into the insulin socket. Sure. Now that's a hormone receptor, but it's sort of the same thing, right? There's sort of the same thing, and we can inhibit. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. But we can inhibit or modify the effects of enzymes and their substrates in a bunch of different ways. Allosteric control. We're going to go through, these are the 8 things. And I just want you to know these 8. So allosteric, competitive, non-competitive, uncompetitive, mixed, suicide, accumulation of product, and phosphorylation. And this is the one that leads us into mTOR, which is what we're going to start on Wednesday, because it is Monday today and I can't keep track of my days. So let's start with allosteric control. Now you can increase or decrease with allosteric control. There's an allosteric site. We've seen this slide. This is from lecture 21 when we were talking about hormones. We've seen this exact slide. I just pulled up lecture 21, took a screenshot of it. This hormone is going to fit into this sort of active site where it belongs. But there's something else may be able to bind, right, to that receptor that modifies the shape of this thing or alters it somehow. Same thing with enzymes. Exact same thing with enzymes. You have an allosteric site, an alternative binding site, where these inhibitors, typically inhibitors, bind. And so like this little thing that's going to interact and is going to modify this, right? So allosteric control is you can increase, right? If you have allosteric activation or positive modulation, you have some little guy, some little thing go bind to an allosteric site, not the active site where the substrate binds. Substrate binds to an active site, not that, but it binds to an allosteric site, an alternative site, and that changes the shape of the active site. And that either makes it more sexy or less sexy, right? It makes it more appealing or less appealing to the substrate, whatever that substrate is going to be. And so, allosteric activation, let's put some, attractive, I don't know, makeup on Jessica Rabbit or something. Allosteric deactivation, this is just maybe scary. I don't know. It's increasing enzyme appeal to some people. I would be terrified. I would just be like, look, I'm worried. I'm scared you're gonna have like roid rage on me. And so, but this would be, for some people, maybe that would be allosteric activation. For others, it would be allosteric deactivation on Jessica Rabbit. But what happens, and this is where, PFK is a rate limiting step in glycolysis. Let's talk about that exact phenomenon with allosteric control, allosteric inhibition. Now, PFK, glycolysis. Glycolysis, the purpose of glycolysis is to create a bunch of ATP. Right, it takes 2 ATP to get glycolysis started, but it yields 4, so you get a net yield of 2 ATP, a gross yield of 4. You guys have heard this stuff. It's not actually really true in an exercising human being, but I'll talk about that later. Really, what you're getting is 3 ATP because you skip hexokinase for the most part, and I'll actually mention that one later. But with the backward accumulation of product and backward inhibition, but we have PFK. phosphofructokinase. Now, ATP is used at this site. When people say, well, all right, it takes 2 ATP to get glycolysis going. Glycolysis yields 4 ATP, so you get a net yield of 2 ATP. Again, don't write that down because it's not really. I mean, it's like true in yeast and whatever. But you consume ATP here. You have to consume ATP at the PFK step, at hexokinase and at PFK. You consume ATP. And if you have an abundance of ATP, tons of ATP, glycolysis maybe isn't the energy cycle you should be running. Metabolically, it's inefficient. This is like a super inefficient energy system. What you want to be doing is a bunch of oxidative phosphorylation, right? You want to be generating a lot of ATP for as sort of a little investment as possible. And ramping up glycolysis is not the way to do it. So if you have a ton of ATP, ATP binds to an allosteric site. Whoops. ATP binds to an allosteric site back here. And that changes the shape of the active site. And now it's no longer as sexy to its substrate. And so you're halting glycolysis. If you stop PFK, glycolysis sort of shuts down. You can't keep moving forward, right? You don't get its product, so you don't move forward. So glycolysis gets shut down. So this is allosteric control. ATP binds to an allosteric site, an alternative site on the enzyme phosphofructokinase, this enzyme PFK. It's needed at the active site, but if you have a ton of ATP, it binds to the allosteric site. That changes the shape of the active site, and now you shut down glycolysis. So let's do competitive inhibition. So competitive inhibition is they're both competing for the same whole, right? So let's go back. Let's make this no longer PG. This is like PG 16, and they're both going for the same. They're competing. Let's go PG 13. They're both going for the same date. They're both, two guys are going for Jessica Rabbit. And Jessica Rabbit can only, she's not into polygamy. Okay, she's just like, no, I'm a monogamist, and I'm not going to cheat. And so she's like, I'm only going to pick one of you. Well, if the inhibitor gets there first, the substrate's, oh shucks, he says, because it's 1965 at the dance, at the high school dance. Shucks, I don't have a date. I'm going to go by the punch bowl. And whatever, you get what I'm saying. Only one person gets to hook up with Jessica, gets to date Jessica Rabbit. I hope you guys know Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Otherwise, it's like, who the hell are you talking about? And this, I've like ruined the lecture. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a weird, it's a really sort of a creepy movie from like 1988 or something. Anyway, so you have an inhibitor and the substrate, and they're both going for the same place. They're both going for the same one. Now, zidovudine, this is like HIV medications. These are examples. You don't need to know any of these examples as long as you can identify what it is. So zidovudine, really the famous drug as an antiretroviral. It's a competitive inhibitor of DNA polymerase gamma, and that's where its side effects come from. Its side effects come from being a competitive inhibitor of the thing that, like mitochondrial replication. It inhibits that thing. Emtreva, this is blocking reverse transcriptase in that way, and that's its primary effect. So whatever. HIV drugs are working in that way. Now, non-competitive inhibition, there's no preference of whether it's bound, it's unbound. It's not like there's one hole that it's competing for. It has its own little site over here. Like let's get all allosteric about it. And so we have our own site. And if the enzyme is already bound, that's totally fine, right? If the enzyme is already bound to its substrate, if the enzyme is unbound to its substrate, totally fine, right? So that's what it means by non-competitive inhibition. And it blocks the reaction, right? So it's a conformational change, and the effect gets blocked of that enzyme. So it's not like it binds to an allosteric site and changes the shape, right? It changes the conformation, the shape of the active site, and then the active site the substrate doesn't bind to it anymore. That's allosteric inhibition. Non-competitive inhibition is it's going to change the actual effect of what's happening, and it's just like, okay, you go ahead and bind, don't bind, whatever. Um, Remember when I talked about cyclooxygenase inhibition? The sort of graphic expression, cyclooxygenase inhibition. If so, some of you you know what I'm talking about already. That's sort of what's going on here. And for those who didn't get the joke, it doesn't matter. It's not helpful. But it binds, and it just sort of blocks the actual effect of yeah, go ahead and no, yeah, go ahead and date, but I'm over here distracting you. I'm not going to let you guys consummate this marriage. That's sort of what it is. And this is just an example. I have an example of each of these. Heavy metal toxicity. If you have lead poisoning, they don't put lead in your pencils and your paint and whatever, gasoline. They don't put lead in stuff anymore. It's a non-competitive inhibitor of what zinc, of the enzyme zinc, is supposed to bind to. And so heavy metal toxicity, lead poisoning, non-competitive inhibition, and it affects what zinc is supposed to be doing in your body. Uncompetitive, okay, this is different. Uncompetitive is different from non-competitive. So lithium, this is like bipolar disorder. This sort of the classic medication is lithium. And I have the whole explanation on the next page of phospholipid generation of phospholipids in the bilayer and how this drug actually works. It's fascinating, but you don't need to know it. But it's called potentiated by the substrate. This one, uncompetitive. It's different from non-competitive. Uncompetitive. The inhibitor is only going to bind after the substrate binds. So let's say here's your socket, right? And there's no other plug right here. There's no plug, okay? And then once the substrate comes and binds, and it's going to do its reaction, let's power up, whatever it is, it comes and binds. Then you see the other socket appear where the inhibitor binds. So if I say, what is the form of inhibition that's potentiated by enzyme substrate interaction, something like that, that's going to be an uncompetitive inhibitor. So this is just how lithium works, how it works in that way. It is fascinating, but who cares? It's fascinating if like you or a family member or a loved one or something is taking lithium, then you're like, oh, that actually is a cool version of this drug, and it's a good Nirvana song. But mixed inhibition, this is the one. I'm not going to ask about this one, but it's in the list, and it's sort of the same thing as non-competitive. You remember non-competitive, it doesn't care, right? It's going to come bind. It's like, I don't care if you're unbound, I don't care if you're bound, I'm going to sit down next to you, I'm just going to mess up your reaction, right? So that's mixed inhibition. It's sort of the same thing, that it has this preference of whether the enzyme is bound or unbound. That's sort of the major difference. And ACE inhibitors, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. This is sort of one of the classic examples. And again, you might encounter it in the literature. Mixed inhibitors of angiotensin converting enzyme, blah, blah, blah. Who cares? I'm not going to ask about this one, but it can affect affinity for a substrate. It can affect affinity for a substrate, but it always decreases the reaction rate. The reaction rate of that enzyme, it decreases that, but it can affect the affinity for the substrate also. It's a messy one. I'm not going to ask about it. Suicide inhibition is sort of a unsympathetically named irreversible reaction. It's a very violent version of competitive inhibition, and it's irreversible, right? So what happens is you have the inhibitor go bind where the substrate is supposed to bind, right? It's derived from the enzyme's normal substrate. And then it starts going through the reaction. And then it realizes, oh shit, this isn't my substrate. And then it's an irreversible reaction at this point. So we're sticking with horrible analogies. So it's not horrible, but today has been a day where we talk about like prostitution and like transition into like Jessica Rabbit, which isn't that much better. So let's stick with this. So you like the lights are off and you're like, oh, I think this is my partner, oh, come over here, and like you start You just get started, right? You don't complete the reaction. You don't consummate that thing. You don't complete the reaction, but you start catalyzing that reaction, and then you're like, well, this is like you have huge teeth. This isn't what I expected, and and then like, oh, oh, you're not who I thought you were, and then like the relationship is over. Like there's no coming back from that one. Like you know what I think about cheaters? How dare you? Whatever. You get what I'm saying. This is suicide inhibition. It's you think the enzyme thinks it's, if we can assign thought to this, the enzyme thinks it's the real substrate, and it starts. If this were a game show, we would say whoopee, right? That's what they make whoopee. I think that's what they say on bad 80s game shows. And then like, oh crap, this isn't the substrate. This is an inhibitor and it's permanent, right? This is a permanent one. So that's how aspirin works. A cyclooxygenase, a COX blocker, right? It's a cyclooxygenase inhibitor, but it's a suicide inhibitor. Zidovudin's primary action on reverse transcriptase, that's suicide inhibition. Earlier, I talked about it with its effects on DNA polymerase gamma, and that was a competitive inhibition with that one. This is a suicide inhibition with its real effect, and then penicillin also. Transpeptidase, DD transpeptidase, who cares? You don't need to know those things. Accumulation of product. So this is really our timer of, we're at number 7 of 8, so we're almost done. Accumulation of product. This one I sort of telegraphed this pass earlier, where hexokinase, this is the first enzyme in glycolysis. Not really. It is if you're going from glucose, sure, but if you're going from glycogen, it's not. You don't even touch hexokinase. Doesn't do anything from glycogen. So hexokinase converts glucose into G6P, glucose 6-phosphate. If you accumulate a bunch of G6P, it backwardly inhibits hexokinase. Accumulation of product. If you accumulate a bunch of G6P, it inhibits hexokinase. Now, it's actually fascinating how it works because, and some of this, we talked about glycogen phosphorylase, glycogenolysis, glycogen lysis. Let's mobilize with PKA, protein kinase A, let's mobilize a bunch of glycogen, a bunch of sugar. Glycogen phosphorylase chops off a little chunk of G1P, glucose 1-phosphate, and let's move that phosphate with phosphoglucomutase, and now we get to G6P, and we haven't used hexokinase. So if you start exercising, you start going through a bunch of PKA phosphorylating this glycogenolysis cascade, and so you get a bunch of G6P without using hexokinase. You get it from your glycogen, and that accumulation of this backwardly inhibits hexokinase, which is nice to preserve blood sugar when you are exercising. You don't need to clear your blood of all of its sugar when you're exercising. You just sort of clear your muscle and liver of its glycogen stores. And that way you don't have like a, loopy end of the marathon, you're going to get it. But you don't get like end of the marathon, hit the wall loopiness 3 minutes into exercise because you're, inhibiting hexokinase. And that's also the reason you actually get 3 ATP instead of 2 out of glycolysis when you're exercising, a lot of your glycolysis when you're exercising. The last one, phosphorylation toggling of active and inactive forms. Now, most of our proteins, a great deal, Emma, a great deal of our proteins can be and are at the moment modified by phosphorylation states. And these kinases, protein kinase A, protein kinase B, all of these kinases are phosphorylating stuff. If you're a kinase, you're phosphorylating enzymes. To phosphorylate means you attach a phosphate to it. Attach a phosphate to this thing. That's phosphorylating. And we have thousands of different proteins inside of cells. Inside of a cell, you have thousands of these proteins. And phosphorylation can occur on numerous sites on those proteins. So you can phosphorylate it over here and it has this effect, phosphorylate it over there and it has that effect, and it's a single protein. Abnormal phosphorylation on these proteins is a big culprit for disease, for sort of chronic terrible diseases. Abnormal phosphorylation is a big player. Now here's our example. We just covered this one, glycogenolysis, right? So glycogen phosphorylase, I just mentioned this one, chops glucose 1-phosphate off of your glycogen. Glycogen, right? Stored in the muscle and in the liver. You got a pound of this stuff on board, give or take, whatever. And most of it in the muscle, another 100 grams or whatever in your liver. And glycogen phosphorylase enzyme ACE, glycogen phosphorylase chops a little chunk of glucose 1 phosphate, G1P, off of your glycogen. Then you go through phosphoglucomutase to convert it to G6P. But glycogen phosphorylase has an active and an inactive form. When it's active, it's turned on. It's doing its thing. Remember the light switch. I can turn on the lights. I can turn off the lights. Phosphorylation. If one light is on, so this light is on, and if you can see me, this light is on, and if I phosphorylate it, I turn it off. But this light, if I phosphorylate it, I turn it on. Right. So it sort of depends. It depends on these phosphorylation states of things. And so if you phosphorylate glycogen phosphorylate, you turn it on. Glycogen synthase, we've talked about this one before. You phosphorylate that and you turn it off. Right, so phosphorylate both of them, and you stop synthesizing glycogen, and you promote glycogenolysis. You promote glycogenolysis, and you halt glycogen synthesis if you phosphorylate both. Now, so phosphorylation activates glycogen phosphorylase, and this starts glycogenolysis, right? Chopping little glucose 1 phosphates off of your glycogen. Phosphorylation deactivates glycogen synthase. And so it stops depositing money in the bank. Now, protein kinase A, we know all about protein kinase A, right? That phosphorylates phosphorylase kinase, which phosphorylates glycogen phosphorylates. And then we know what happens. We're mobilizing carbs. Protein kinase A, the same kinase, phosphorylates glycogen synthase, which deactivates it. So if you turn on protein kinase A, and you are going to mobilize carbohydrates because of phosphorylation states. Protein kinase A phosphorylates stuff. When it phosphorylates some stuff, it turns it on. When it phosphorylates other stuff, it turns it off. And you know how this works. Right? Epinephrine. Let's get us going. Right? Epinephrine initiates that phosphorylation cascade that turns on pKa. You know that. We've gone through this one. And so if you're in fat, if you're in liver, if you're wherever you are, you're mobilizing energy substrates through a phosphorylation cascade. Here it is if we're in the liver and we're mobilizing carbohydrates. Adenylyl cyclase or adenylyl cyclase converts ATP into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP binds a protein kinase A, a kinase, an enzyme that phosphorylates stuff. It phosphorylates both of these. Right, it turns off glycogen synthase. I don't need to deposit money. I'm trying to pull money out of the bank. And it turns on phosphorylase kinase, which then phosphorylates glycogen phosphorylase. Glycogen phosphorylase starts mobilizing your glucose in the form of G1P, and then phosphoglucomutase converts it. Okay, so there's a few questions and that's everything about enzymes. And I'll put up a little review slide next time, but types of questions you should be able to answer, stuff like that. Some extra self-quizzing about hormones and PKB or AKT. You don't need to know about lipoprotein lipase. I've mentioned it a couple times, so I'm not going to ask about it on the test. Getting into IGF and T3, T4, stuff like that. So if you wanted to just look at the slides, we went over a while. Okay, so questions. Do we have some questions?
A question on steroids and breeding true understanding. If we're looking to impart better understanding of steroids, their use for the public, under what category should we identify them? Under nutrition, create their own category? How should we look at them or try to express them if we're trying to communicate that with others?
Okay, so how do we classify steroids if we are to withdraw some of our misplaced damnation? What sort of classification does it get moved to? That's the question.
Yes.
I think we classify it with. That's a good question. I don't think we classify it with creatine and just these you go to S Mart and pick up your Safeway has their little bottles of creatine and whatever, and I don't think we classify it there. Ephedrine has been removed for you can't just go buy that next to oh, here's vitamin C and vitamin E, and here's your, folate and whatever, and here's your fat. You can't go buy it like that anymore. I think you have to go to the actual pharmacist to get it. I think steroids should be maybe controlled by doctors where you actually do need a prescription, but maybe the prescriptions shouldn't be. You can say like, look, I need to get cleared for this stuff, and I want to be monitored. I go ahead and if I'm a sissy, I don't want I want pills. Pills for pansies. I want to take pills. I don't want to do injections, and I need to monitor my liver function and my whatever cholesterol. And so I think maybe in that way where, yes, it is a prescription, but you can go to the physician and say, look, this is for human athleticism. This is for performance enhancement. And get on a controlled dose and sort of monitor it and legalize it where there's like tons of tax money. I imagine, I've never looked it up, but I imagine cannabis is just like the most profitable thing to governments as soon as it gets legalized. I mean, it's all cash in those stores, and so there's I don't know how much goes under the table, but the tax revenue from cannabis has to be like, I mean, the best decision that any government has made in a really long time. And I imagine with anything, like let's say hypothetically, that argument, kids though, we got to keep kids off of drugs, and okay, legalize steroids, anabolic, androgenic steroids in sports, and have all of the tax revenue go to like keep kids off of drugs campaigns. Not like Nancy Reagan, just say no, but like really effective stuff where you have like $10 billion and you're just like, okay, this is a campaign to inform people. Whatever, maybe something like that. I don't know. I haven't really thought too far into the political ramifications or the type of environment that would be welcoming to inviting to steroids being accessible. It's a good question, and I'd be open to suggestions, and you guys would have probably better ideas than I do.
Well, this is
And
what confuses me, because last time we discussed about this, like you mentioned how like America has like terrible regulation and all that, but like we've banned these substances. So like when you opened my eyes to all of that, I got super confused. I even did a little bit of research on certain like vitamins after you mentioned that,
mhm.
like over the counter, be aware of it. And I was like, oh shoot, well maybe I should take a look at that.
It's a fascinating contradiction. This that you bring up about the U.S. is so regulated. About this is banned and this is we're so tight in our restrictions, and sort of the Bidens of the world, of which he is the majority. I mean, I'm the minority of positions, and like I don't understand why steroids are bad. Remind me and you get all these ridiculous arguments. The Bidens of the world, really, that's sort of everybody. That's like 99% of all people, at least, are like, Biden is right and Courtney's wrong. Why don't you use your? I feel like I talk to kids. Use your words. It's like I have to say, like, use your logic and walk me through where it makes sense what you're saying. And like, well, I can't, but emotionally, and so in the U.S. we're so protective, I think, of our emotions and sports and stuff, and sort of emotional safe spaces are in like politics and sports, and yet the economy sort of runs amok a little bit. And I will talk about that, dietary supplements to health education act of 94, and I'll even show you can look it up ahead of time, but the Mel Gibson commercial, maybe I'll upload the full thing and then we can watch it ahead of time or something. But this ridiculously long Mel Gibson commercial about like, do you want your government regulating your oranges? Like it was like vitamin C, like an oranges. He says that when like the DEA raids his house and he has like a vial of vitamin C, and he's like vitamin C, and he's like being handcuffed. It's like like an oranges, and he says it like a psychopath that he becomes later in life, and it's stuff like that allows the supplement industry to make an outrageous amount of money. I don't know. It is a really weird position that you point out, that over on one side we're super emotional and protective, on the other side we turn our head and we just pretend nothing's going on.
Yeah, because it did raise my awareness of like how like I play water polo, so like our strength and conditioning coaches, our head coach James Graham, like told us beware, like have third party approved and all that. I didn't really understand it if you read it, and it's the same thing. But I mean, after you mentioned that, definitely heightened my awareness to it all.
Yeah, yeah. You need the sort of independent lab testing, third party approved, whatever it is. The NCAA maintains their list of these are supplements that we've tested, and they contain what they say they contain, and there's nothing illicit in there. But yeah, it's a weird time. It has been for quite some time, a weird time for supplements. But yeah, because they'll ban. It's like you go to jail for, I mean, if you just have, one bottle of andro, they're not going to, like, throw you in the slammer. Like, they're not going to do that. But when you look at the sentencing possibilities, it's just pretty severe in the fines and imprisonment for this stuff, for Schedule 3 controlled substances. And yet those are the things you see. You see a ton of andro in, oh, well, if it's like glutamine or something like that, just throw them in there, and it'll make the glutamine work way better. Does glutamine work? I don't know. You have like immune system problems. Maybe it'll help a little bit. Or, I don't know. Glutamine doesn't really work all that well, but it has andro in it. Yeah, sure, that'll work. Just don't list it on the label. So I think that's sort of what people do now is, yeah, you just need like third party testing.
I wish I feel like you take a very Socratic like form of argumentation, and it's like really convincing for those that are willing to be convinced. But then like you sit back and you look at the general population, and it's just like we give them facts and data about like for example the coronavirus, and none of them take those facts, and like you look at the number of deaths and like this is kind of serious, guys, and it's like not as serious as reading. But we do it with facts and Socratic method. It's like, well, your argument is flawed. Like, I'm not actually contributing to this argumentation. I'm just asking your standpoint until your standpoint falls apart. And it's just, and that's how, like, for steroids, it's like, well, what is your argumentation? Here's the 9 listed. All of that is bumpkiss. Like, I can't get behind any of that.
Yeah, so I don't know what else to do in these arguments. And I've had these arguments with people about coronavirus who, masks don't do anything, whatever it is that people say. And I'm like, dude, the reason I think maybe now is probably the first time it can start to make sense. Why did I talk about Anastasia at the beginning of all of this? I talked about 19 teens in Russia. Like, why did what did the Romanovs come up, and why the Bolsheviks like like gunning them down? And I don't think their guns sounded like that, but why did I talk about that? But the idea is, like, you present people all the facts in the world, all the evidence, all the logic, all the reason, all the facts. You give them the consensus of science, and people are like, nope, I don't believe it. Well, there's nothing else I can do then, because I've given you all the information that exists to my knowledge, and you are not open to reason. If you are not, persuaded by it, then it's just like you're gonna. That's like the problem with COVID. It's sort of the problem in life, and where people are just unwilling to accept fact. If you present facts, or the closest thing to facts that you can get, okay, let's get philosophical and say there's like no such thing as facts or whatever. Okay, whatever. The closest thing to fact that we can get. And there's no amount of evidence that you can present to people that changes their mind. And I accept that. So I start with Anastasia.
You've definitely instilled a phobia of making claims that are too verbose, because then they can just be torn apart. It's like, you really don't understand this if you're making it that much. So my claims are like 5 word long. It's just, I can't make any other thing, because otherwise it'll just be destroyed.
That's science. It's funny. You go to these conventions, go to conferences and whatever, and people just will walk this like knife edge of qualifiers. Whatever they're talking about, I will do this too. If I present somewhere, I'll do the same thing where I say, well, I'm not talking about this, I'm not talking about that. I know profoundly little about this, profoundly little about that. You hear me say some of this stuff in lecture even, and you know, if I'm saying like, I don't know anything about cardiovascular physiology, that's Van Ness, you know, or I don't know, whatever it is. And you just sort of, you keep um, your area of expertise, you shield it, you sort of protect and shield it, and you don't stretch it too far, because then you can, you just start picking up criticism that's valid. You know, so you stay within your narrow road.
All right. Well, this is a little off of what we were like going, but can you go over allosteric control again?
Yeah.
I said
Okay.
it.
So, um, really, that's like a super important one. That's like is number one. Enzymes. This is like like over here. You can see the socket, right? So there's two plugs in there, and if one of those plugs was active, like it powers my electronics, like this one, this is my computer. This one right here. This one is like for the Fitbit, but it's just, let's say this modifies the like voltage or watts or whatever of this one. And if something is plugged, like right now, the socket is working fine, but if I plug in an allosteric inhibitor, okay, like the shape of this would change, right? Okay, so nothing's plugged in. This is the enzyme. Okay, and then I come, and so if nothing's plugged in, then I could come plug in my computer, the substrate, right? What's supposed to go in there. But if I plug in an inhibitor at the allosteric site, the alternative site, it changes the shape of the active site. The actual, there's like a conformation change, it changes the shape. And like I can't get it in the hole anymore. And so there's allosteric activation, allosteric inhibition, whatever, some sort of allosteric control. You're altering the active site. All right, are we getting out of here? Any other questions?